Assuming from the list that I sent you this morning.
Oh, did you send me the? You didn't send me the whole
Not the
list.
whole list, just from their affiliations and what I can see.
How big is your mail?
I don't know. So we sent, well, our CC1 mailing list is about 1,000 and then.
Okay, welcome to the October 2019 version of Green Infrastructure, Climate and Cities. So this seminar series is broadcast online and also shown here at Drexel University. For those of you joining us for the first time, this is a collaborative effort from the Consortium for Climate Risks in the Urban Northeast, a NOAA-funded RISA team, as well as a variety of other partners. And again, I give an introduction just for those of you who are joining us for the first time. We typically have each month, it's the first Wednesday of every month, held here physically at Drexel University, though you can attend online if you are one of the many people joining us today online. We usually have 1 to 3 speakers who present, and then we have a discussion, so please hold your questions till the end, and then even if you're attending online, you can submit questions through the YouTube link, and we will transmit those directly to our speaker. For those of you, again, who are joining us for the first time, these talks have been going back to 2014. If you go to the CC Run website, you can download or actually view any of the presentations that we've done up to that time. I'm excited to announce that this month, for the first time, we are offering continuing education credits for professional engineers. So if you are a professional engineer, if you have a colleague who's a professional engineer, we can give you a certificate of completion that will help you get satisfy your continuing educational requirements. So we ask that you just contact us. If you're attending online, if you could put your name in the chat box and let us know. And if you're attending here in person, we have certificates that you can come up to see Corinne or myself at the end of the session. You can put your name and you'll have a certificate that counts. Okay, so we're very excited about this. This makes climate and green infrastructure now a topic for professional engineers to have no excuse to say that they're not studying regularly, at least monthly. So it gives me pleasure to announce today's speaker, who is Dr. Donovan Finn. He is an assistant professor at Stony Brook University in the Department of Environmental Design, Policy, and Planning. He teaches courses in the Sustainability Studies program, Environmental Planning, Policy, and Design major. He's trained as an urban planner and has worked in East St. Louis at the University of Illinois' SLARP Center. SLARP is the East St. Louis Action Research Project, where he has consulted with lots of local governments and in Illinois and Missouri on growth management and sustainable development policy. And currently he's working at Stony Brook on research in this sort of interesting area that we've been discussing in this seminar series on sustainability and resilience planning. And he's focusing mostly on the New York region. And so with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Donovan Finn to come up, and we'll shift over to his presentation. He'll speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have an open discussion. What you got here?
How's that, guys? All right, so thank you for showing up today and for having me and getting me here. So very briefly, this talk actually combines a couple of different projects that I've been working on that I thought might be interesting to try to kind of smash them together a little bit for this audience, for engineers, since I am a planner. But I'm interested in this question of resilience broadly, and particularly in the question of the planning response or effort towards resilience. The work I'm going to talk to you about today is a lot of work I've been doing since Superstorm Sandy with a number of colleagues, Yu Zhao at Portland State, Divya Chandrasekhar at University of Utah, John Travis Marshall at the Georgia State College of Law, and others, and funded by NSF and the National Center for Atmospheric Research at Boulder. So I probably don't have to tell any of you, I'm just going to jump right in here, probably don't have to tell any of you that climate-related disasters are a growing trend and a growing problem. And here's some info from NOAA just from 2018. These are all of the events, natural events, quote unquote, that had $1 billion or more price tag. And just some images to kind of give you a sense. This is Darlington, Wisconsin, Marshalltown, Iowa, various places. And those of you who are back here. Those of you who are from this region may recognize some of the images from Superstorm Sandy that I'll show you in a minute. But I'm interested in one kind of particular aspect of this question of resilience. Well, a couple aspects. I'm going to talk about one and then I'm going to talk about the other. So the first large-scale study of post-disaster recovery, right? So the disaster happens and something has to happen afterwards. Some series of decisions have to be made. And the first real sort of systematic study of this phenomenon started to happen about 50 years ago or so, 60 years ago. Really one of the first landmark studies, like real kind of comprehensive studies, was this publication, Reconstruction Following Disaster in 1977. And in that book, the authors ask a pretty straightforward question, and this is completely pertinent. It could have been written yesterday. Immediately after disaster, public officials almost always speak of rebuild and to, quote, make this city better than ever. But if this happened, how does it develop? Well, I'm a planner, so that's actually what I care about a lot, right? I care about how we make cities better, and I care about how we make cities better, right? Those are the two things that I care about a lot, and that's what planners care about. It just so happens that this question is being asked in the context of a post-disaster recovery process as opposed to just regular sort of blue sky, day-to-day planning. When we think about disaster, some of you may have seen this graphic before. This is kind of a typical traditional way that we've long thought about the disaster recovery and response process. So at the top you have an event, right? Something happens, an earthquake, a fire, tornado, whatever, and immediately there's some life-saving response and quickly that evolves into some sort of long-term recovery. And then at some point, once we get things sort of quote-unquote back to normal, although that's not real, there is no back to normal, there's a new normal, but anyway, we get back to some new normal, and then we start thinking about how we can maybe protect against the next thing that may come along, and then at some point we get ready for the next one, and then we do it all over again. And this has been this is the classic model of the disaster recovery cycle, and this circular, very sort of methodical, orderly process. But I think recently, we have been experiencing so many disasters of so many different types, with so many varied and extensive impacts, that as a field, we, and I mean planners, engineers, architects, politicians, you name it, have begun to sort of think of this in a different way. And that really we have to start thinking about resilience, in other words, that future, that sort of mitigation aspect from here. We have to think about that from day one, so that the recovery doesn't happen and then we start thinking about the mitigation and the protection later, that the two are inextricably linked. And here's just some examples of other folks who are also making that argument or pointing out that phenomenon. And so instead of this nice, perfect cyclical process, we have a much different, more complex. I've been trying to come up with various ways to represent it graphically. This is one that I'm toying around with at the moment. That the recovery process really needs to be interwoven with our questions of sustainability. And when I say sustainability, I use the broad definition that includes environmental sustainability, so climate adaptation and climate change mitigation, but also developing a thriving economy and promoting social equity and all of those things. And then resilience woven in there as well. And all of these things at the same time. Instead of we respond, then we recover, and then if we have time and money left over, we can maybe think about about the other stuff. But instead, I want to argue that it's really important that we start thinking about doing this in a much more holistic fashion. So disaster recovery typically has many dilemmas. I could spend all day, but I'll just highlight a couple for you. One is that one way to think about it is that we could measure disaster recovery, right? The process by which a community once struck gets back to quote unquote normal. You can do it quickly or you can do it well, right? And sometimes those things are in conflict, and you can kind of add on to that an additional layer of complexity, which, as Tom Campanella points out, is that no matter what we as public officials and architects and engineers and urban planners do, the people struck will wake up the morning after the disaster and start doing something. They will start packing to move away, they will start ripping out sheetrock, they will start rebuilding, they will start doing something. So we have to act quickly. A good way to think of this, just briefly, is if you have a bucket of stuff called time after a disaster, you can make a lot of decisions quickly and not really think about them very much, and just kind of get a lot of stuff done and not really have a very analytical process. Or you can spend a lot of time and a lot of money, right, of course, on a few things and make sure you get those absolutely right. My colleagues Rob Olshansky, Lou Hopkins, and Laurie Johnson talk about this as a question of time compression. Right? After a disaster, everything that happens in normal day-to-day life of running a city has to suddenly happen at light speed. And so how do we make all those decisions and make sure that equity is being advanced and make sure it's economically prudent and make sure we're spending money efficiently while still making sure the economy is running and that we're protecting things that weren't protected before? And all of these questions are really very complex. The second challenge, and again, there are many, but these are two I want to highlight, is that we have this, this struggle between, as Cates, Colton, Laska, and Leatherman say, between recovering the familiar and reconstructing in safer, better, and sometimes more equitable ways. What I like to call betterment. Right? Let me explain that for a second. Here's us, right, today. A disaster strikes. Here's us tomorrow. The day after tomorrow, we could rebuild like this. Or we could rebuild like this, exactly how we were before. And typically what happens is some people want to rebuild like this, or build, and some people want to rebuild like this. But if you rebuild like this, certain things won't be protected, certain old inequalities will be perpetuated, etc. If we rebuild like this, things will be lost. So how do we balance those two things? So I think actually Superstorm Sandy represents a really interesting case study in sort of the evolution of what I'm calling sort of this resilient turn in recovery planning. And there's a lot of lessons here, and I'm going to go through them relatively quickly because I want to get to the second half of the presentation as well. But I think that this is partially out of necessity and partially out of sheer luck that Sandy struck the region that it did. Relatively speaking, a high capacity region, much different than say New Orleans, right? A lot of expertise, a lot of political clout, a lot of social capital, a lot of access to economic capital. All these things kind of created, I used to have a petri dish slide in here, I should have left it in. Created sort of a perfect petri dish for understanding how we could go from sort of this business as usual recovery, just build back to what we had before, to something else that I think is really a model for going forward. So Sandy, as some of you may remember, although it's getting, I'm getting older and it still seems like it was yesterday to me, but Sandy made landfall on October 29th of 2012. It was a massive storm, caused 147 deaths worldwide. Estimations vary, but somewhere over 70 billion in economic losses in the US, most of that in New York and New Jersey. At the time, Sandy was more damaging than any storm that had ever, any hurricane that had ever happened before except for Katrina. Within half a decade, it was eclipsed by Harvey and Maria, but for a time, it was second only to Katrina. In response, the federal government allocated about $50 billion in post-sequester funding to rebuild from Sandy. And a lot of that went to federal agencies, but a chunk, about 13 billion, went to New York State, New York City, and the state of New Jersey. For them to spend with a significant amount of federal oversight, but much as they saw fit, given local contexts. And as we argue, in a piece we just published in the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research. Sandy provides really timely examples of communities, and I wanted to say for the first time, but the reviewers dinged me on that one, but nonetheless, whether it's the first time or not, it presents timely examples of communities using planning to not just address the urges of recovery challenge, but really pivoting towards this goal of climate change adaptation and community resilience in a very illustrative way. So, what did the federal government do? Well, one thing the federal government did very quickly was appointed a task force, the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force, headed by Donovan, that issued this Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Strategy. It's a book about this thick. And almost everyone I talked to for 2.5, 3 years when I went to their office, they had a dog-eared copy of this on their desk. And it was 69 recommendations about sort of a framework for managing the recovery anytime there were federal dollars involved. One small piece of that, one of those 69 components, was a big project some of you may have heard about called Rebuild by Design. It was funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, but it also had a number of nonprofit partners, and that's really an important piece because those nonprofit partners funded a really robust, so the HUD money, about $1 billion, funded capital projects, rebuilding and infrastructure type projects. Those nonprofit partners provided the funding for a really robust participatory planning process to inform those designs. So this was a widely heralded program. There were 148 applicant teams from around the world that applied to be part of this program. 10 were chosen. They were each assigned a geography or an issue. They came up with a cascading series of proposals, and finally each team was sent off to come up with one proposal for the region to try to get funded. 64 public workshops were part of this, hundreds of smaller meetings, etc. So those nonprofit partners, led by Rockefeller, ponied up about $3 million for the design process and the logistics, and then just shy of $1 billion post-sequester was set aside to implement the project. And I'll just give one example. There were 10 finalists, 7 were funded, 3 were not. One example is the Staten Island Living Breakwaters project. So this is 2019. These were announced in 2014. It's 2019, and the Staten Island project is supposedly any day now breaking ground. I believe it's been through all its environmental reviews. But a process of developing a breakwater off Staten Island, so using rubble to create wave breakwaters, and then also green infrastructure, oyster beds, native grass replantings, monitoring of water quality and storm surge and other things. And so sort of a whole suite of interventions to try to protect the Staten Island shore from slow onset climate change as well as future extreme events. Another example that I'll talk about in a few minutes in a little more detail is this, at the time it was called the Big U. It's had about 10 names. This was a $250 million, I think, that was put towards this project to essentially build a 10-mile multi-use berm or levee around Lower Manhattan, and stretching up both sides of the island. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But this was one of the other projects that was funded. And so all of these projects were large infrastructure projects meant to protect different parts of the region, but they also had a specific mandate to include issues of social equity, efficient use of public resources, aesthetics, environmental protection or enhancement, a whole suite of sort of ancillary benefits. Another innovation that the federal government really kind of embraced, this was born actually out of experiences the federal government had after 9/11, was basically getting federal agencies in a room to talk to each other with also state and local agencies. This doesn't really sound like much of an innovation, but the people from HUD told me, oh yes it is. It is quite surprising that we got all these people in a room. And the SHRIC, as it was called, the Sandy Infrastructure Resilience Coordination Committee, has now been replicated after a few subsequent disasters by HUD and FEMA around the US. FEMA also, even though we really typically think of FEMA, and for the most part their mandate is short-term, sort of boots-on-the-ground disaster response, short-term response, They do have a long-term recovery mandate as part of what they do. And after Sandy, they developed on Long Island in particular quite a few partnerships connecting other federal agencies with local governments that needed sort of recovery and resilience building, technical assistance, and we can talk about that more, but I want to move on. New York State did a lot after Sandy as well. The governor created this Governor's Office of Storm Recovery. We call it GOSR, G-O-S-R. It had a number of areas: infrastructure, community reconstruction, business, and housing. One of those aspects, and again, I'm only highlighting the pieces here. This is not a soup to nuts overview of the recovery from Sandy. I'm really trying to highlight just those pieces where I think long-term planning for recovery and resilience were sort of made to overlap. So another aspect of this was, after storms, it's very often we see a lot of federal money going to rebuild housing. Well, the state of New York, and New Jersey as well, to be honest, one of the things the state did was created some buyout programs to try to buy out some of the most flood-prone properties that were damaged by Sandy, instead of paying the homeowners to rebuild them, sometimes yet again after previous storms, to just vacate. And there were two programs. There was a standard buyout program in which the state acquired the land and the property. They then sold them off through auction to people who signed a deed restriction, essentially saying that they would rebuild them to more resilient standards. And then there was an enhanced buyout program. These are both relatively small, to be honest, but there was an enhanced buyout program, the purpose of which was to buy these properties, tear them down, do as many in a single area as you can, and return it to natural space to serve as a storm buffer. Staten Island is the most famous example of that, the Oakwood Beach area. The state also created to what I know, to be the most extensive community-led recovery planning project that's ever been undertaken. Got a couple of names. New York Rising is what most people call it. It was also called the Community Reconstruction Program. Essentially, the state, not unlike Rebuild by Design in some ways, they allocated $25 million for communities to hire planning consultants, and then another $600+ million for implementation funding. So the idea was communities who were struck by Sandy would make plans, and they would get some money to make those plans, and then they could implement those plans because they would each be given a little pool of money to get started, and then they would try to find other federal, state, or even bond finance funding sources to do these projects. So here's just a couple examples in Baldwin and West Islip. All kinds of programs from hard infrastructure to policy innovations to economic development, you name it, they were included in there. The other thing that happened in New York State is the state wisened up, or the governor wisened up, and in 2014 signed the CARA, the Community Risk and Resiliency Act, which basically mandates that the state create, adopt, and use a state sea level rise projection. So if you need if you need a state permit, sorry, not a federal, if you need a state permit for a project in New York State, if you need state money, if you're using state money, you have to look at the state sea level rise projection. You have to consider it in your designs and your implementation, etc. New York City, another great example, and again, this really only scratches the surface. The city has been on a tear, publishing guidance for every sector as new buildings are built, as buildings are redesigned, as all kinds of, whatever it is, there's a resilience handbook pretty much for it at this point. City Council passed a number of laws in the immediate wake of Sandy to make it easier or sometimes mandatory to consider risk a little more upfront in decisions around development, redevelopment, management of buildings. The city revised, it started in July of 2013, so less than a year after Sandy, they already had a zoning code text amendment in place, and that's actually still, I think it may actually be fully complete now, but it's taken a number of years. One of the problems that was quickly realized is if you want to get FEMA money and you want to rebuild, and you're not participating in a buyout, you have to elevate your home, especially if you're in a place like Long Beach or in this case in New York City in the Rockaways. And well, guess what? If you want to elevate, you have to go taller because you have to take your old house and lift it up some number of feet. And guess what? The zoning ordinance says you can only be a certain height. So what do? Right? So our own policies begin to conflict with our resilience goals. So this zoning code rewrite did a number of things. It now allows mechanical equipment. It used to not be a permitted obstruction above the roof line. Now it is in flood zones. It basically lets homeowners sort of claw back some of the height. So if they're in a X foot height zone, and they need to rebuild taller because they've been flooded, they're allowed to go some number of feet above that limit based on the design flood elevation for that neighborhood. The city also created a pretty robust, within just a few months, created a pretty robust resiliency plan called SIR, the SIR report, the Special Initiative for Rebuilding and Resiliency. And this was a combination of city staff and consultants who were tasked with basically thinking long-term in the midst of recovery. So sort of just this dynamic that I was talking about earlier, right? Recovery is happening. I talked to planners who were involved in this, and I said, it was tough because we were talking to people in Staten Island who were living in their garages that they were heating with a space heater through the winter, and that's how they were living. And we were trying to get them to think, 10, 20, 30 years out what we could do to protect their neighborhood, and all they cared about was getting back in their house. So that dynamic between sort of speed and doing the right thing was a challenge. This cost about $2 million to create this plan, had 257 initiatives and a $20 billion price tag. When it was released, about half of that had been identified, and they're still working to implement it. It took both a citywide look at where we had risk, where we were facing risk and where we had resiliency opportunities, as well as drilled down on a few specific neighborhoods. This one, sort of southern Brooklyn, Manhattan Beach, Coney Island area, and looked at specific projects that could be done in those neighborhoods. Department of City Planning created a special initiative called the Resilient Neighborhoods Initiative, where they looked at an additional number of neighborhoods. Mostly these were neighborhoods that were kind of weird by New York City standards. They didn't conform to the typical sort of lot sizes and housing structures, mostly coastal. A lot of places with sort of these strange summer bungalows that turned into full-time housing without really ever being sort of fully code compliant. And so the city did a lot of work in those neighborhoods to help the residents figure out how to protect themselves, either with individual actions or by thinking through what some of the strategies the city itself could create. So here's just some examples of those reports here. And they really got down to the fine-grained details of kind of the individual neighborhoods and what made them uniquely challenging, and how individual homeowners or types of homeowners of types of units could address those challenges. They also looked at retail, and the city also looked at retail in addition to housing. The city published its One New York plan. This is Mayor de Blasio's kind of baby that was published subsequent to Superstorm Sandy. And while the first iteration really had nothing involving resilience, it was very much an equity plan for the city. How do we grow and advance equity? Resilience kind of becomes a central organizing theme for the second edition of this plan. And not just coastal, but also heat and other issues. So really resiliency has become sort of suffused across city agencies as part of the purview. This is how the Department of Housing Preservation and Development really has a focus on affordable housing, but they took this opportunity to rethink some of the risks faced by this community. Edgemere as one example, and how to both supply more affordable housing and rejuvenate and revitalize the neighborhood, and make it more resilient to future extreme events, all at the same time. Lastly, I just want to touch for a second on this East Side Coastal Resiliency Project. This is the current version of that Big U project that was funded by Rebuild by Design, and this is really a project to spend about $1.5 billion to protect a couple miles, I think, I forget the exact numbers, of Lower Manhattan, by essentially taking an existing city park and raising it up a few feet and creating better waterfront access and a number of other things, but also creating a storm buffer for a good chunk of Lower Manhattan, and that is still going through the design and approval phase, and they've yet to break ground on that, and it's been actually quite contentious recently because they kind of overnight changed the designs, and the community, which thought they had bought into one plan, was presented with a different plan that was going to go forward, and so there's been quite a bit of debate and discussion about that as well. I'll also note that the Mayor's Office of Recovery and Resiliency, which was created in the wake of Sandy, just recently renamed itself the Mayor's Office of Resiliency because, as they told me, the recovery is over. So we're done with recovery. Now we're just going to focus on resilience. There's some great people there. I'm not sure that the recovery is over in every neighborhood if you talk to everybody, but anyway, they're now the Mayor's Office of Resiliency. Just a couple other quick examples. The city of Long Beach, this is not just New York City that used this opportunity of the recovery to really start thinking about how we're going to rebuild better, right? Build back better. Long Beach, which is a suburban community in Nassau County on the South Shore of Long Island. They had a comprehensive plan passed in 2007 that didn't mention the words sustainability or resilience once. 5 years later, Sandy strikes, and they just threw that plan out and started over. And they created a whole new planning process called Creating Resilience. And one of the things they really tried to do there was to combine their comprehensive land use plan with their waterfront plan that was really more about sort of protection and enhancement of the waterfront, and think about how that was affected by and affects, as this example shows, this graphic shows, the rest of the city. Hoboken, similarly, some of you may be familiar with Hoboken. It was essentially a tidal marsh. It was an island and a tidal marsh, and then it became attached to the mainland of New Jersey. It still has wooden sewer pipes in some places, and it was heavily damaged by Sandy. The whole city was without power for about 10 days. I believe it is the most densely populated municipality in the United States. And so they really have taken on a very robust planning process to recover from Sandy and really sort of use the environmental and economic engine of recovery to really advance their resiliency. And so they're buying property, they're acquiring property, they're turning it into parks that can absorb stormwater, adding bioswales, rainwater harvesting on public buildings, all kinds of projects. It's a real citywide initiative. These are just some examples, and just to give you a sense of this, since Sandy, Hoboken has produced, by my count, over 2,000 pages of new plans and policy documents, all related to storm protection, storm recovery, and resilience, specifically. To say nothing of all the other stuff they've done as well. There's been a lot of self-help planning as well. The region is famous for a lot of community-based, community-led planning in the Rockaways in southern Queens. LISC funded a community planning project called Rockaways Community Planning and Envisioning, and really looking at how the neighborhood could help itself if the city, if they weren't happy with the city's efforts. Similarly, in Staten Island, there was a project called Staten Island Imagines, really where Hunter College and the College of Staten Island and some local civic groups really created their own citizen-led plan for what they wanted to see happen with the rebuilding and recovery of Staten Island. I want to give you one quick counterexample. This is New Jersey. They did it a little bit differently. They also got a comparable amount of money. So New Jersey, New York State, and New York City each got about $4 billion in fairly flexible community development block grant funding, and they used it in different ways. How New Jersey did it is they created a program where the counties that were most affected by Sandy could apply for all of these little tiny grants to do all kinds of various things. If they applied for all of them, they could get about $700,000. But really, if they wanted to do anything, they wanted to build anything, as this program paperwork said, they needed to find that money elsewhere. The state was not going to supply it. This was just money to make plans. And so in a state with 565 municipalities, many of them small with part-time mayors and no planning staff, and et cetera, a lot of these places that were heavily devastated by Sandy had a problem where not only did they not have the money to implement these plans, they didn't even have the money to write the grant to get the money to make the plan in the first place. They just had zero capacity. And that was a real challenge. So And the other problem is, and of course in New York State at the time under Governor Christie, climate change was a verboten topic, as these examples from New Jersey Future highlight. And New Jersey Future is a smart growth advocacy organization in New Jersey. And so after Sandy, they came up with the idea of creating what they called the LRPM program, Local Recovery Planning Managers Program. And they basically hired 3 planners. They assigned them each to 2 communities that were heavily struck by Sandy, that had basically no planning capacity, no planning staff, very little in the way of bureaucratic infrastructure, and they assigned them as local planners, and they helped these communities do risk assessments, they helped them apply for grants, they helped them do quite a bit of work, and they did that for about 2 years until the grant funding ran out. But the communities that had this really seemed to think it was a valuable effort, and it just goes to show that sometimes money is not enough. You really have to overcome some of these capacity deficits, which I think is really important as well. So we got started a little bit late, so I think I have a few minutes left. I want to just briefly talk about what we learned from studying all of these communities and going to many public meetings and interviewing a lot of officials after Sandy, and then briefly give you an example of I think where we can go in the future. So we really argue that the Sandy experience illustrates 3 key points. None of them are surprising. None of them are unique, but I think they're heightened and they highlight the challenge of making this turn from recovery to planning for resilience. The first is that existing planning capacity and culture matter a lot. Those places that already were doing a lot of planning before Sandy found it much easier to pivot towards this sort of resiliency focus for a number of reasons. Political leadership matters an enormous amount. Who is controlling the purse strings and setting the policies is incredibly important. It's not the most important thing maybe, because sometimes it can be overcome, but in concert with other aspects, it's incredibly important. If you have a governor who doesn't believe in climate change and won't let you spend any money on climate change efforts, you're going to have a problem in funding resilience projects, for instance. And then lastly, of course, it's all about money. And there's just never enough. So we're really going to have to get creative about the ways that we think about resiliency planning and funding these public projects. For instance, to buy out one neighborhood in Staten Island was all that the state could afford to do, and that was only a chunk of that neighborhood. But the decimation of Sandy was widespread across the state, and so really figuring out ways to more creatively fund these recovery programs is going to be important. So creative, fast, and cheap, right? Can we do them all at once, or do we have to do one or the other? I don't know, but we're going to have to try to figure out a way to get there. And I also just want to mention that as laudable as I think is a lot of these efforts where there are clearly a lot of people, individual families and homeowners, who feel that they were wholly left out of this recovery process. And so that is an ongoing challenge that we have to figure out how to address. This is one example this is in Broad Channel in Queens. So that's what I think we've learned from Super Strong Sandy, is that we can use the recovery process after a major disaster to make a turn towards resilience. I also have another project where I'm looking at sort of the Dutch experience, and I will explain why, because people keep saying stuff like this. This is in New York Times, right? Oh, the Dutch know how to do it. They can save us. But we really don't know what that means, and I'm curious to understand that. For a local planner in Iowa, what does she think that the Dutch can do for her, right? So that's what I want to know. So I've been working on this project. I was in the Netherlands last year. I've been doing some follow-up interviews. The Netherlands is famously a place, the saying goes, anybody know what the saying goes? The Dutch say about the Netherlands? God created the earth and the Dutch built the Netherlands. Because they basically reclaimed it out of a swamp. And much of Dutch master painting is about floods. If you go to the Rijksmuseum, you'll see a lot of paintings of floods. There's another one. The image on the right, the map on the right, that's that portion of the Netherlands that is below sea level. So you can see that they are a high-risk place. They basically reclaimed, they have this whole series of, they call polders. They basically reclaimed land for farmland. This is Amsterdam, right? You can't live more near the water than this. That is waterfront property for sure. And this is how the Dutch have traditionally thought about managing water. You keep it out And when you flood, you build up or you dump it out, back out over the wall, and you just kind of keep doing that forever. And for decades, that is how the Dutch did water management. They built these massive infrastructure projects, like some of the ones you see here, to keep the water out in a series of thousands of dikes across the country. The problem is they are realizing a few things, and one of them is that they care about sustainability also, because oil is expensive. And much of the backbone of the Dutch water management program, as it exists today, depends 100% on diesel fuel. And if that diesel fuel were to dry up or skyrocket in price, it would be incredibly difficult to maintain this project. And they've also been struck by more recent flooding. And so starting in the early 2000s, the Dutch really started to rethink how they do water management. And I think that there are some great lessons here, and I'm just going to show a few quick examples and then talk about what I think some of those lessons are for that planner in Iowa. But basically they said, you know what, we can't keep the water out anymore, we're going to have to learn to live with it. So one of the big programs they have is this project called Room for the River. I don't speak Dutch, so I'm not going to try to say it in Dutch, but it's the Room for the River project. You can see some of the components of that. One example is this project here in Nijmegen, where they're taking this river where there's a pretty extreme bend and it's prone to flooding, and they're basically widening it out. They're widening the river, they're widening the river channel, they're moving some communities, they're creating some new hard and soft infrastructure, basically to let the river do what the river wants to do instead of fighting against it. And this has been politically difficult, it's been incredibly expensive. It's a huge public works project, as you can see. But this is the new way that the Dutch are trying to move forward with, basically changing the mindset of the Dutch, who, some of the planners told me that one of the most difficult challenges in water management in the Netherlands is that Dutch people have been raised to think that they are smarter than water. And so they don't actually think they're at that much risk because the system works so well. But if you're a technical expert, you know that it's very fragile. And so getting the public to buy in is actually quite difficult to these new approaches. Amsterdam is doing a lot of work. They have a project called Rainproof Amsterdam, where they're combining sort of city planning, rainwater management, sewerage, a bunch of different components of the city are kind of working together to create sort of fine-grained and macro-scale projects to address urban flooding, so greening projects on public land, creating mechanisms, policy mechanisms, zoning and other things to incentivize developers to build new types of architecture that work as stormwater sinks, essentially, incentivizing green roofs, green parking lots, and this is maybe my favorite presentation slide. I don't speak Dutch. Does anyone speak Dutch? Anybody want to guess what that says? That's a very Dutch thing to say, I think. No rain, no beer. And so, part of this is a public relations campaign, and part of it is an engineering challenge, and they're trying to kind of meet in the middle and convince people to to build rain gardens in their front yards and to build retention cisterns under their parking lots and put green roofs on their buildings. But the city is also doing a lot as well. They're building a new neighborhood. This one is called Eiberg. It's a series of islands outside of on the edge of Amsterdam. Its stated purpose is to capture some of the young families who are moving out of very expensive central Amsterdam out into the surrounding suburban communities. But what it also is a highly sustainable, resilient neighborhood of both houses on land, and this is, fill. So these are islands that are being created, and then they also have floating houses that are on sort of these. They're not houseboats; they're houses, but they're on sort of these floating mechanisms, so they can rise and sink with the changes in water level. But essentially, these islands and even the blocks within them, each are little tiny self-contained watersheds, and they work as this really carefully engineered system that is very different from how we would design a suburb today in the United States, and also how they designed neighborhoods even a few years ago in the Netherlands. They have this opportunity to start from scratch, and so they're really trying to think of how they can use sort of every single piece of this project to manage stormwater in this case in particular. Rotterdam is famous. Rotterdam, the biggest port in the Netherlands. It has one of the most famous those large engineering projects, the Rotterdam Seagate, which I can't pronounce because it's in Dutch, but the city has been doing a lot to climate-proof itself. That's kind of the new lingo, I think, in the Netherlands. And they have Rotterdam has a resilience strategy that encompasses a lot of different pieces. So there's these canals that going through the middle of Rotterdam that are designed to flood. There are parking garages that have both blue roofs and are designed to flood if need be, and sort of act as rainwater detention. Orlyplein is a park, playground, park area in central Rotterdam, just outside of, not too far from the main train station. This is like a famous example. I was there last year, and this is designed also to flood on rainy days. There's lots of issues and challenges like this. For one thing, who maintains it? Because the Public Works Department maintains it's a park, and the Park Department maintains it's the responsibility of the Public Works Department, and no one cleans the leaves out of the pipes, and then the whole thing doesn't work, right? So there's still lots of challenges to figure out. But what can we learn from all of the Dutch? They do all this cool stuff, and it's great. But what can we learn from it? So this is one of the projects that I'm trying to kind of think through a little bit. And I think there are three things that we can learn from the Dutch. The first is that they use water as a tool. They always have. They have a history of cooperative planning, and they understand the need for soft defenses, not just gray infrastructure, but also green. And I've kind of tried to narrow this down to some lessons that I'll just briefly mention here, but time, scale, and complexity. Basically, the Dutch understand that they have to start acting now, which I think is an urgency that we have not quite yet developed in this country. They understand that resilience is going to be very micro-scale decisions down to the level of the individual household, all the way up to these massive infrastructure projects and everything in between. And it's not just one or the other. That's also something that I think we need to get better at. And we need to start working across professional silos. And that is the folks I've interviewed in the Netherlands say that is an ongoing challenge there. Clearly, I know it's an ongoing challenge here as well. But we have to get more interdisciplinary if we're going to solve these grand societal problems. And this is probably the quote that sums up this research more than the other. This is a Dutch engineer and planner, works for the city of Rotterdam. And he was telling me about the work they're doing. He said, look, here's the deal. If you have enough money, you can always solve a water-related problem with engineering. If you have enough money, every problem is solvable. But if you don't use that opportunity to also at the same time solve a social problem, an environmental problem, an economic problem, then you've squandered the public money and public trust. And we have to get better about thinking of that as kind of a holistic system. I like to talk about that as being, we have two ways we can go about things. We can sort of build walls and protect ourselves from whatever might come at us, or we can use the image of the spider web, something that's more, has its own sort of inherent beauty. It's resource efficient. It bends before it breaks. A lot of these things that we hear over and over again, but we really have to kind of understand how to really implement those and move them into how we manage and plan our cities. So I'll leave you with this, this graphic that I'm still working through, and I think this is my latest iteration of it. But I think that the really important evolution of resiliency planning is that we have to figure out how to intertwine it. When there is a major disaster, we have to intertwine resiliency into the process. And even when there's not, we have to remember that resiliency and sustainability sort of go hand in hand. And those two things can't be kept separate. So with that, I will open it to questions. And if you'd like to contact me for any reason, there's your contact info. And thank you again for coming. Yes?
I have one comment and one question, and I should say, full disclosure, I used to work for the state of New Jersey.
Okay.
As a planner, working with towns to build resiliency. So I think that the case study of New York City, and New Jersey do provide like an interesting contrast and approaches, but I do think there could be some refinement in your argument about what New Jersey has done. Just some things that I'm thinking of, the state did develop at a governor's level an office to help with recovery. there were a lot of communities that participated in DCA's planning program. I would encourage you to speak to planners at the Department of Environmental Protection who were working post-Sandy to fund groups like New Jersey Future, Renters, DVRPC, et cetera, through the Resilient Coastal Communities Initiative, through projects like New Jersey Frames in Monmouth County, which I think is doing some of the most innovative resiliency work in the country. Comprehensive regional resilience planning, looking at sea level rise and sort of increased storms. So, but full disclosure, I used to work for the state, so it is near and dear to my heart, but given that you included, activities for New York City, many years post-Sandy, I would encourage you to talk to more people in the state because there's a lot of activity now. Climate change was not verboten, but the words were changed and it was more sort of under the radar as the state was working with communities to plan for sea level rise. So there wasn't a lot online that you could find. So that's my comment. My question is, you mentioned for New York City that they are developing a lot of design guidelines and have asked people to consider sea level rise. And so my question is, consider and require are two different, and so I just wanted to clarify, has the city mandated that sea level rise is included in building heights or other design guidelines that you know of? So,
well, there's the state, the CARA, or the Community Risk and Resiliency Act, and so that's when their state, well, first, thank you for the comment about New Jersey. Some of this work was done a while ago, pre-Governor Murphy, and and a lot of it was I would be sitting in a room with people and they would say, well, we know, a planner, town officials, we know this to be the case, we know this, this is how we need to do things. But there are these structural challenges because of the way the state was at the time doing things. And certainly this is painting with a broad brush, right? And I'm actually working on a project that looks at a bunch of the programs that you mentioned, frames and some other things. Because Blue Acres, for instance, in New Jersey has been really innovative. But I think the point I was trying to make there, maybe it was a bit inelegant, is at a broad level, the two states went about things probably could not have gone about things very differently. Once you get into the fine-grained details, obviously the story becomes a little more gray area.
And your point about implementation funding, that was a big difference, and it makes a difference.
So as for the second question, the state has the Community Risk and Resiliency Act. The city has, the zoning code has been rewritten and updated, and there's a lot of ways that individual homeowners, business owners, can now address sea level rise risk and extreme event risk much more easily than they could before. If they're taking federal money, obviously they have to go by FEMA standards as well, those places in the flood zone. And then I haven't looked at the most recent zoning code rewrites, so I don't really know the details of what has been mandated in some of those neighborhoods. But it is something, if we're going to get there, we're going to start mandating that people do something differently. It's not going to be enough just to say, well, you can do this, it's allowed now. Of course, the other challenge is cities change very slowly, right? And some of these buildings are 150 years old, some of which actually dealt with the storm better than the others. But be that as it may, cities take a very long time to regenerate. And so no matter what we do, it's going to take a long time for that to happen. But yes, certainly we're going to have to start mandating more. Right now, I think the politically easy lift is to incentivize, to allow, but it's the mandating that will be the hard part. But I think ultimately it's going to be necessary. Thanks. Yes.
I have a question. So in the range of possible solutions, ideas, responses that you presented, some of them are very nimble and effective at a very fine-grained scale, like some of the green stormwater infrastructure initiatives, and others seem to be more applicable, appropriate, effective at a really macro scale. And so to what degree is our collective ability to respond and become more resilient constrained by the difficulty for implementing some of these macro scale ideas, which to be effective might need to be implemented across multiple jurisdictions? Like if one jurisdiction does it, it doesn't really work. You need the whole chain at a much larger geographic scale. To what degree is our ability to respond effectively limited by that political challenge, or process challenge? And are there tools or changes you might suggest that would help make that kind of thing more possible?
So one of, if not the biggest challenge of, I think, of resiliency planning broadly is that we live in a capitalist democracy. So it's very difficult to do these things, right? And to sort of even drill down a little bit, I think one of the specific sort of attributes or examples of that is the fact that we have this thing called home rule, right? So in most states, the states devolve a bunch of their power to local governments, and local governments can do, within reason, whatever they feel is appropriate within their borders. The problem is that they have another town right across the town line, or a little ways away, that may want to do something completely different. And in this country, again, unlike the Netherlands, and the Netherlands is certainly not perfect, but in other places in Europe, in this country we don't have a strong tradition of regional planning, regional decision making, and we don't really have a particularly strong history. California would be kind of a counterexample. We don't have a particularly long history in a lot of places of strong sort of state-led, maybe Maryland and some other places too, but so state-led planning. So we have this challenge that is micro scale, right? It's getting individual homeowners and business owners and landowners to do things, and then it's macro scale because we need policy changes and infrastructure projects that span entire regions. And because we live in a capitalist democracy, it's hard to force those individual homeowners and landowners to do things. And it's also hard to create those big, expensive, first of all, but also complex, both in an engineering sense and a political sense, projects that would protect some number of communities without making, whoever's on the edge that gets left out more vulnerable, either remain vulnerable or maybe even, hopefully, not perversely enough, become more vulnerable as a result of what we build over here. So this whole challenge of regionalism and regional planning in the United States is it's an ongoing challenge for many issues, but it's really, I think, this urgency of this question of resiliency has put it into very stark, very stark light about how important it is. And New York State is trying to do some regional planning. The governor has incentivized, but it's really around economic development for the most part. Some states are working on it, but it's, we have set up a political system in which making regional decisions is really difficult.
I have a comment. Full disclosure, I work for FEMA and West CB coordinator, so I do want to represent. And so years ago in Louisiana, after the March 2017 or 2016 floods, the way FEMA gives money for mitigation and projects and stuff like that, and it's usually given to the state, and then the state decides how the money gets divided. And so in Louisiana, it was basically you cannot, as a community, you are not going to get the money. They were going to kind of regional, and it was kind of watersheds, right? Then you did it based on watersheds. And so they were giving money to a watershed versus a particular community to ensure that within the watershed, a community is not going to get money for a project that could have downstream impacts to another community. So it's really, doing that macro level analysis and doing it on a watershed basis. But that, that is Louisiana, in their thinking of how to look at, resiliency and how to do infrastructure projects without, pinpointing specific communities. And then I worked in Texas, and they gave us a list of, we were doing recovery. They gave us a list of about 350 projects, and it's all these different communities. I was like, well, what is the, is there any analysis as to how these projects impact other communities? And there was nothing done. It was just like, hey, we surveyed all these communities, and they just gave us this list, and we want the money. And so I kind of said no, because you're like, we need to do more of an analysis of the impacts.
So the contrast there would be that in the watershed example, there's a watershed level entity who can help overview and administer the
Yeah,
coordination
so
of that.
more of these kind of like, a lot of the parishes were kind of coming together, and there wasn't necessarily a watershed entity. They were coming together and developing these kind of like regional planning councils, what you would call a regional planning council. I did work in Nebraska after the flooding this past year, and we were working through the economic development districts, which are also their regional planning, and we use them because there is no capacity at the local level as everything, because they have that broader way of thinking and planning. They do the economic development, and they also provide capacity to the community. So the RPAs or RPCs or whatever you call them, the COGs, are really huge in this because they have that on-site, on-the-ground level of understanding of these communities, what they can and can't do, and the politics, which is very important, and then just that capacity and capability to really help communities through this process.
One of the things, sorry, just to pick up on there, and then I'll get the question in there. One interesting thing that I didn't point out here for lack of time, but so that when New York State incentivized this planning through the Community Reconstruction Program, they hired these consultants, and then they would assign them to communities, and sometimes typically they would assign them to an area, right, to make it easier. So consultant A would be working with community 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 that all happen to be nearby. And I've asked multiple people this, and I can never get a consistent answer, but I don't know if it was consultant-led or community-led, but many of those places ended up taking their little pots of money and combining and creating a plan that was shared across, say, 5 communities. So they would put all their implementation money together, they would have one consultant working on it, and the consultant would write a plan for, say, 5 or 6 communities, and they were planning a sort of what I would call like a mini region. Because these are typically contiguous municipalities that just so happen to be located along a coast or something. And so it's not unheard of that on a voluntary basis that some communities can be shown that there is a logic to thinking small regional scale, also pooling the money so that whatever projects are built are maybe a little bit more efficient. What I have heard, of course, is anecdotally, is then what happens is if project number 1 on the list is only located in 2 or 3 of those municipalities, and one of the communities over on the edge, their project doesn't make it on the top 5 or whatever, there was some kind of bad blood or whatever. But I think that there is, I hope that the urgency of this challenge will start to change the way of thinking of planners have already drank the Kool-Aid, for the most part. Town officials, even some of them that I think may be relatively conservative in their politics, in New Jersey, on southern shore of Long Island, that I have talked to have been pretty clear-eyed about the risks they face and that they're going to have to do something. They'll say things like, well, I grew up here and the water never used to come here and now it does. They don't like attributing cause, but they're willing to recognize the effect and the potential harm. So I do think there is some potential shift going on in terms of how we think about this kind of question of home rule and regional planning and regional governance, but it's slow and the need is fast, right? So there's kind of a temporal mismatch there that I don't know how to overcome. Sorry, the red shirt over here, and then, are we
You
at
know,
time?
question, so,
Okay,
yeah.
sure.
But you got it.
Okay, thank you. So I really appreciated the overview of things that have happened in New York and New Jersey. And then I was a little surprised to hear that you wanted to take lessons from the Dutch for the planner in Iowa, as opposed to New York or New Jersey. In large part because it does seem like many of the conditions that are being experienced in the places you identified in the Netherlands are more similar to New York and New Jersey. So I was wondering if any of the projects that were proposed post-Sandy were consistent with the principles that you drew out of your study of the Dutch's, the approach of the Dutch?
Yeah,
or
well,
if you would have a recommendation for one.
So there's a bunch of pieces to that. One of these is, so I keep getting told, so tired of hearing about New York City. It's not like anywhere else. What lessons can we take from it? It's too unique, whatever. And my answer is always, well, every place is unique in its own way. And I think New York City is this great petri dish because it is such a high capacity place that they were able to experiment and pilot things that no one could have tried anywhere else because it has so much capacity. And some of them work better than others. And those are the things we can learn from, right? The things that worked are things we can learn from and we can transfer elsewhere. And so I've been making a concerted effort not to always focus the lessons learned from anything on New York City. And so I think that's why I extemporaneously mentioned, because I think that the Dutch lessons are probably the most, along the Eastern Seaboard, they're probably the most applicable, right? But I think there are also some of those lessons, I think, or we're told, that we could, any place that is at risk for flooding, whether it's riverine or, or coastal or Great Lakes or whatever, that there are lessons to be taken from how the Dutch have been doing things for hundreds of years, right? So, but yeah, so after Sandy, there were armies of Dutch consultants, planners, engineers, all throughout the tri-state area, and a lot of that thinking really is baked into what the region is doing to try to recover the gas. So yes, plenty of Dutch companies, plenty of Dutch consultants have been involved in all of this post-Sandy stuff here in this region. But I also think, I hope, just because, I have spent a significant amount of time talking to these, I'm more focused on the planners than the engineers in the Dutch context, but I spent a fair amount of time talking to them, and I think they do, they always say, oh my God, why would you want to talk to us? We're terrible at this. Like, if you go to the rest of the world, everybody thinks you're great at it, right? So, but I do think that there are some important lessons to learn because they've been dealing with these challenges for so long that other communities in the United States are really just waking up to right now in 2019. And so that, if nothing else, is kind of the real lesson. There's an online question?
Yeah, going from planning to implementation. The question is, while communities like Hunts Point, Edgemere, and Red Hook receive money for resilience planning, very few projects have moved forward for implementation. Do you find this to be true in your research?
Yes, for sure. Hey, Philip. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, that's absolutely true. It's easy to plan. That's the easiest part. Coming up with ideas is relatively easy. Even developing, I think, some sort of community consensus about plans can be a relatively straightforward process if it's done well. And I think a lot of the planning processes after Sandy were quite well done. They were well funded, and they did the right things, and they took time, and they deliberated, and they used a lot of technical inputs, but they also listened to people, and planning 101 was great. It's less easy to get money to build the stuff. And then if you can do those two things, it's even more difficult. Those of you who've ever worked on a project and actually seen it built, I'm sure can attest. It's even more difficult, even when you have the money, even when you think you have consensus, to get it built, because of course, once it moves from being a plan to being a project, there's a whole new slew of environmental impact statements and all these other things that have to happen. The smallest tweak can have these sort of ripple and downstream effects. People feel like they, no one ever asked me, why you were going to build this thing. Well, we had 32 public meetings in your neighborhood, you didn't come to any of them, but now here you are, once we're ready to go. So the challenge is really, it stretches way, having a beautiful, perfect plan is not even the start of the battle, unfortunately. And so it can be very difficult very complex. Also, I have been told by unnamed sources that a lot of the planning that happened that was pretty quick after Sandy. It was relatively quick, it was a lot of public engagement, but there's a lot of scientific input into it, right? But maybe there wasn't a lot of analysis, technical analysis of the projects themselves, and they got a bunch of money thrown at them, and then when they really went to engineer the thing, they realized, oh wait, like, this was great in theory. So I was specifically told this about a bunch of the Rebuild by Design projects, but also some of the other projects, that they just, you know, that balance between doing it right and doing it fast, they took a particular path through that, and sometimes it turned out that they went too fast. Even though it's been slow to some people, it was too fast, because when they went to actually start getting ready to put shovels in the ground, they realized that from an engineering standpoint, there was a whole other level of analysis or a whole other level of work that had to be done to it. So it has been very slow. Yes.
So I was curious from your research, do you have any recommendations moving forward for the region? I studied New York and New Jersey. FEMA has come out with a new program to provide funding for communities it's called Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities as part of funding that's going to be set aside every year that communities can compete for. So I was just curious if there were any findings from your research that you would say, yes, that's going to move resilience planning in this area forward now that we have some funding to implement projects.
I think probably the single most important thing communities can do is not get complacent, right, and not forget that Sandy happened, and keep moving forward, whether it's making plans or getting money and doing projects, or and there's never enough money, right? I said that before. Full stop, period, right? But I think there are many things that communities can do that seem like they might have marginal benefit, and they will take a long time to show benefits, and they will need to sort of aggregate and multiply, but that they can have benefits. So simple things like zoning code rewrites that they cost money to hire attorneys, you have to have public meetings. But at the end of the day, they can begin the process of so that the next subdivision that's built, the next apartment building that's built, whatever, is just a little more resilient than before. And it's that sort of incremental, slow, and those are the easiest. Those are the things we could do tomorrow, that we could start on the process of tomorrow. Green infrastructure type of projects, anything. I think one of the things that New York City has been good about is maybe even a better example is I'm from Kansas originally, and a while ago I was speaking to a planner from my hometown where the word sustainability has definitely not been on the table, right? And he was telling me about this particular project they had, and it was a green infrastructure project, and he was like, we just completely sold that on its economic merits and on its sort of economic development type merits, but also on its efficiency merits, that this costs less than pipes. And it was easy, but we never pitched it as being sustainable or resilient. We kept the code words out, we just kind of forged ahead just on its technical merits. And those are ways, I think, that, I think we have to be honest with people, but I think we also have to learn to speak, planners that is, we learn to speak in ways that don't cause ourselves undue challenges that we don't need to try to fight against. And so I think maybe in some ways being more sort of practically oriented is important as well. We need a lot of money, But there are things we can do that don't necessarily require as much money, and I think we can find ways to politically navigate them. One of the things I never learned in planning school, I think I graduated from planning school thinking that planning was an apolitical act. It was for the public good, right? We're just all working for the public and we just want to make our communities better. And one of the things I have realized in this context and others is that planning is inherently political, right? It couldn't be more political. And so I think that's really important to understand in how we navigate the politics of these. Everything's an engineering challenge until it's a political challenge, right? And the political challenge is much, much, much harder. There's a lot of really smart people who can figure out the engineering. It's much more difficult to navigate the politics. And that would be a lesson I would take away, for sure. My phone? I'll go here.
Hi, yeah, my question is about the kind of like catch-all for people who have to move. So you talked a lot about the government buying out like homes and areas, and when you're talking about the Netherlands, they specifically created like a section for a certain demographic, like with probably some sort of incentives. And I was wondering if in your research you've noticed that communities who are being bought out, like the planners have maybe made agreements or helped kind of direct them so to convince the people to leave in order to go forward with that plan.
If I understand your question, I think that there's a whole burgeoning research field on this whole coastal retreat community relocation question. There's a lot of people much smarter than me studying. One of the big challenges, again, comes back to this capitalist democracy issue. In Japan, they do things like they'll take a whole neighborhood and they'll find some undeveloped land and they'll raise it up and they'll fill it, and then they'll put that community over there, and then it's kind of like a chess game, and they just retire land and move communities. That's not traditionally been, except for some cases in the Midwest, I think, for maybe Army Corps projects and others. Typically, more recently, we offer to buy out individual homeowners with, fair pre-storm, fair market value for their home. Maybe there's a little incentive if you can get your whole block or your whole neighborhood to move en masse. But typically, those people don't all move to the same place. They just go elsewhere. Some go to Florida, some go to the other side of town, some go, across the river, and they just disperse. And there's a lot of challenges there because the social networks get disrupted and all these other things.
Right. My dad actually works for USACE, and he was working on a project on Long Island, and he was running into problems where people wouldn't leave their homes even though they had already been destroyed, and if they build it up. So they back and forth between trying to get them to, because they couldn't afford to raise it, and there are all sorts of complications, and he was telling me that it would be so much, that an idea would be to get them to move somewhere else via different incentives, not just money, but hey, there's another community, maybe they're not from your community, but they're willing to, either people moving from elsewhere or the community is willing to accept you in some way. But it is. Yeah,
I know there is active research going on. I don't really know the results of it, but kind of looking at whether people are actually able to take that buyout money and end up in a comparable position economically and otherwise. Are they further from their jobs? Do they have to buy a smaller house? Do they lose those important social connections and that social safety net and all of those questions? I have a colleague from Japan who studied this and says, even when they move a whole community, they don't move, it's not like they recreate it down to the square inch, and so things are different and it's never the same, and it's never better, right? Even if the physical housing is better, some of the social connections and the economic aspects that are lost and they can't be reclaimed. But the people are safer, so there's this delicate balance. I think there was a hand here, and then our host.
Yeah. One thing that now that our politicians are moving toward understanding that they need to embrace changes, they're making, but they're moving toward it in some places. People are starting to pop up with long-term goals. Within 20 years, we'll be fossil fuel this. In 20 years, we'll have electric trains, all this kind of stuff. but the same political groups continue to keep their planning at most 5 years long. And can you think of a way to basically move essentially the politicians to understanding the short-term plan? It has to lengthen the planning, so to actually meet a goal. There's a disconnect.
Yeah, I think we do a fair amount of long-term planning in this country. I think part of the problem, I don't know if this exactly answers your question, but I'll give you a quick example here. So I lived in Boulder, Colorado this summer, working at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and I was there one day, and I picked up the newspaper, and because I'm a nerd, I read about urban planning issues in the newspaper, and I read that the city of Boulder was having a study session that night to throw out their climate plan. They had I think a 10 or 20 year time horizon climate action plan, climate change mitigation plan, essentially. And they're throwing it out after 3 years and starting over, even though it still had another decade to run or something, because the observed reality of climate change had already outpaced the modeled projections that they had used as the basis for making this plan. So the plan was already outdated after 3 years, essentially, and so they were starting over, and they were going to try to use better science and more robust process and push harder on some of the policy changes that they wanted to make. But I think that is part of the challenge. Part of the challenge is we need to plan 50, 100 years out.
Right.
But part of the other challenge is we don't know what the future is, and the future keeps sort of changing under our feet, right? And so we have to act short-term and long-term at the same time. And I think that's a real challenge too, because if you publish a plan that has a 5-year time horizon, that means something in that plan you don't plan to do for another 20 years. And can anything wait? Right? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. In the back. Yeah.
I was going to ask something very similar, because I've been in many places lately, both on research or for a consulting project or just as a visit, where there's some adaptation strategy being discussed, and it could be a big, great project. Just 2 weeks ago I was in Venice looking at their Moses storm surge barrier. Or in other cases, there's small scale things like moving equipment to the roof. But I can't tell you how many times I've come up to this situation, exactly what was mentioned, that when you pin the person against the wall who's advocating for some of these solutions and say, yes, but the data is telling us that there's a 10% chance that within 50 years you're going to be there, even though your protection is here. There's then that just sort of gradual, we got to do something now, and so there's this disconnect between the short term, like we have to do something and we're going to do something, but we know that what we're going to do is not necessarily going to work. It might work, it might not work in the long term. And you showed, so I've been sort of keenly trying to find examples when I see them of strategies that seem to have some long-term value, given the uncertainty, but let's just say that, if anything, what we're seeing is that the worst case scenario is becoming more likely, not less likely. So I've been keeping sort of track, and of course retreat is one of those examples if you're talking about coastal risks. And you showed a floating neighborhood in the Netherlands, which I thought was interesting. I saw one in Italy as well. That one kind of piqued my interest because that is one of those things, but I was just wondering if you could comment globally on other places you've seen. If you keyed in on strategies that are being implemented, not just talked about, but implemented, that have both short-term and long-term sort of value given the uncertainty of the future. I don't see too many of those. I just see lots of examples where we got to do something now, but we know it's not going to work in 50 years, and that's just very disturbing to me.
Probably not as well traveled as you, so perhaps I don't have even as big of a pool to draw on, but I think to me the challenge is one of time frame is a challenge, but so is sort of scale in a geographic sense, right? So there's a big debate right now in in New York City. Should we build a Dutch or Thames style surge barrier from Breezy Point to somewhere in New Jersey, right? Some double-digit miles long, I don't remember exactly, to protect all of New York Harbor, right? And then there are other people advocating for we need site level, coastal edge, and individual building level protections, and that is actually more important and more cost-effective. And then there are people saying, well, we should just do both, right? Why don't we just do both, and then we'll cover all of our bases. But of course, the issue there is you can do the simple stuff or the smaller stuff. You could start tomorrow. You could start with some of that small scale stuff, and you can do it. But will it be enough? And so, no, I don't particularly know of. And we're only talking about water here, right? And then there's issues of heat. There's issues of water scarcity. There's all kinds of other resilience issues that, like, it's easy for me to talk about water because I live in New York, and that's a massive issue. But there are lots of other resiliency challenges that are faced also by New York City, New Jersey, Connecticut, but also by other places in the world. And so, can those be solved with the same set of tactics, or do we need this additional set of tactics, right? I wake up in the morning often very hopeful, and I go to bed less hopeful. It really should be the other way around, right? Because the challenges they really are massive. I have little kids, and I'm not really sure what, when they're my age, what the world will be like. And so, I think we have to start somewhere. That's starting nowhere is certainly not an option. We have to start somewhere. But I don't know that there are great models that are just easily replicable or even broadly replicable that we've quite figured out yet. The C40 Cities Climate Mayors Summit is going on, I think, next week in Copenhagen, and I was just looking at the all of the speakers, and they all seem like they're talking about all this great stuff, and I was just thinking, oh wow, all these cities really seem like they have it figured out. But if you go to those cities, would it seem on the ground to you like they had it figured out, like they'd solved all the problems that they're facing? I don't know that it would, right? It certainly doesn't feel like it in the city where I live. It feels like we're marginally more protected than we were against Sandy, and in certain ways and in certain places. But if Sandy happened again tomorrow, there are experts in this room probably who could tell us how much or more or less vulnerable we are. But I don't know that we actually even know that, let alone moving forward for 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now. I wanted to end this day on like an up note. Yes?
You mentioned that the planning that occurred happened maybe quickly instead of well, but was in the absence of engineering simultaneously. This is a very naive question as an engineering instructor. Why the disconnect between planning and engineering in a response scenario? And do you have a vision you could cast for how, this might be the up note, do you have a vision you can cast for how that integration could be heightened in a way that might lead to the balance between fast and well being a bit more robust?
Well, I know why it had to happen fast. It had to happen fast because you're talking, for rebuild by design as one example, you're talking federal recovery money, which Congress mandated 120 months to spend it, right? After Katrina, there was so much graft and misspending and problems and money that never got spent. So Congress mandated that Sandy recovery funds, CDBG funds, had to be spent within 10 years. So if you think of these these $500 million to $1.5 billion projects, those take a long time. And if you start slow, you have to catch up somewhere for that 10-year deadline, right? All that money has to be allocated and budgeted and shovels in the ground before that 10-year deadline, the money goes away. And so I think that was one incentive to move quickly. The other side to move quickly is people want to see things happen quickly after a disaster. And I think they're also open to seeing things. They're open to change, right? Remember the slides I showed of, Mayberry and, City of the Future. And they're open to that alternative vision of the future, but that window closes really quickly, I think, in most cases, broadly speaking. And so you have to strike while the iron is hot. And so I think all of those dynamics, and I'm not saying that the planning was poor, I'm just saying it was relatively quick. I actually think it was quite robust because a lot of resources were put into it, right? It's you can sort of broaden it out. Right? If you spend a lot of money quickly, you can have a lot of concurrent things happening, and maybe that image I showed of all the little boxes, maybe if you stretch that out, that might be a different way to go about meeting that challenge of doing a lot but doing it quickly. So I think a lot of planning happened. I think it was relatively thoughtful, but it wasn't long, and because there is a ticking clock. There's a ticking clock in terms of, I think, what people individual citizens are receptive to. And I think as time goes on, they get more frustrated that nothing has happened, and also less willing for change, and they just want things to go back to where they were. And there's also this ticking clock of the congressional deadline. So I think those two things really served to speed up the planning at the beginning. And that's why there were a lot of probably pro forma calculations and these kinds, but it wasn't, they didn't take it, they wanted to get the project out, get the money allocated, start the EIS right away, get it moving. And at some point, you crunch the numbers and maybe your first pro forma, your first back of the envelope calculation was pretty good, and in some cases it wasn't. And I think that's some of the dynamic. It's not that every project was completely poorly designed. I think it's that some projects were overly optimistic. Others maybe not so much. But I have been told by people who, do this all day long, that there were definitely projects that just were too high in the sky, and once they actually went to start budgeting and, and engineering them, it was much more challenging than they had ever anticipated. Doesn't mean they shouldn't be done, but they're going to cost more. Right? It's going to be that much harder to beat that 10-year deadline as well, which again is just another challenge. Then again, without that deadline, maybe it would never get done. So everything is. Philip.
I can give an optimistic answer.
Yes, please.
And that is that the problem was, and you kind of got at it. I was involved in a lot of these post-standard studies. Was that it was post-disaster, and it wasn't without a disaster. And post-disaster, there's all this freaking out. Oh my God, climate change just hit us, and now we're going to have this happen every year. People have this it has a different mindset, and so it led to rush planning. I could give a lot more detailed response on what was wrong with rebuild by design, or in particular, but that's a simple answer, is that having this kind of process right after a disaster, when you have the 10-year ticking clock, and really rebuild by design was done like a year after Sandy, or not much more than that, and it had 6 months to pick winners. And so there wasn't much, it's just too rushed, and the mindset of people is really different. Maybe it's the only time you can take advantage, of course,
right.
of the money. So
it's a double challenge.
Then they did Resilient by Design in the Bay Area, and I don't know if that was much better, but that would be an interesting comparison, because that was without a disaster, and it was some of the same people. That would be an interesting academic comparison.
And about the same amount of money too.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Thank you. Do you have
Yeah. So
question?
as a student, do you think it would be better that some of these issues with plans being too large and out there, do you think they could be, that things would not end up that way if the people doing the planning had more diverse backgrounds? If, like, say, city planning wasn't originally there, they had like a whole engineering background and then went into it, so would that change anything, or would just the mindset be possibly too overwhelming?
I'm a big proponent of interdisciplinarity. I'm an urban planner who teaches in the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences, right? So my life is interdisciplinary. The problem is we can't all be experts in everything, right? But I think what we can do, and this is certainly one of the, from interviewing these folks in the Netherlands, this is certainly something that I think they maybe recognize, I don't know that they necessarily dealt with it better, but I think they recognize, and it's part of just, I think it's part of their planning culture, or their culture in general maybe, is the real urgency of breaking down those silos. So it may not be that you need to understand that you need to be an engineer and a planner, and that I need to go get an engineering degree. It's that we need to get in a room and talk to each other from time to time, and that we need to be on the same teams, and that we need to learn how to speak a common language. And those things are, I think, are going to be those things will be important, right? I mean, but changing the culture of our workplaces is, we're getting pretty far afield here from the question of how we address in sort of a tactical sense these real grand challenges of climate change. But I think it does get down to that level. We have to develop these kinds of projects and policies, and we have to implement them. We also have to change how we work with each other as professionals in this sort of broad field every day. And so, it's a complex challenge. Which is why it's nice to be here today. Are we,
I guess there's any more
wrapping up?
questions, otherwise I think there's no more questions online. So let's thank Donovan one more time. Come back next month for